Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core, and at long last we have the Android version of the BackBone 1 controller to review today. Now, the original BackBone came out for the iPhone, and I've been using it since the olden days of 2021. And personally, I've been waiting quite some time for this Android release, and so I'm happy to have it tested here today. And this controller is going to connect directly to your phone using its USB-C charging port. And the great thing about this is it's going to work immediately without any sort of input lag, and it doesn't require its own battery either. And of course, the great thing about Android phones versus an iPhone is that Android is much better suited for using third-party emulators and front ends like this one. Now, of course, there are plenty of other controllers that can give you the same kind of setup like this. And quite a few of those setups are going to be cheaper than what we have here, because at the end of the day, the BackBone controller costs $99, which is pretty steep. And so in this video, we're going to do a few things here. The first is to show off the hardware and see how it works. And then we'll also talk about the BackBone app and what it's like to play games using this controller. And then also we'll do a couple quick comparisons against similar options available on the market. And so without any further delay, let's jump into this review of the BackBone 1 for Android. Okay, so this is the box here, and it actually looks almost exactly like the original one that came with the iPhone. On the back, it's going to show a couple of the different features that are available, and when we open it up, you can see it's very bare bones. We've got a single QR code to install the app, and then underneath the controller itself, we have a safety guide. Other than that, I don't really have much to report, so let's jump right into the hardware review of this video. Okay, and first impressions here, this is a very lightweight and nice feeling telescopic controller. And as far as I can tell, this is designed exactly like the one for the iPhone. And the only I/O here is going to be a headphone jack and a USB-C charging pass-through port here on the bottom. Other than that, I would say the overall design here is elegant and simple. And so now let's talk about how each of these buttons feel. We'll start with the D-pad here. Now this D-pad is using a rubber membrane connection, which is a lot like retro controllers as well as the ones that you will find on the PlayStation controllers as well. And so it has a nice bouncy and slightly mushy texture to it. And the travel here is a little bit shallow, but the pivot works pretty well anyway. Each of the edges on the D-pad have a more rounded feel to them, and the texture of the D-pad itself has a matte feel as well. And I do like the slightly grippy texture that's on the D-pad in the controller, but I have found that this texture does pick up on smudges very easily. After just a couple minutes of usage, you can see there are some smudges here on the edge of the controller here. So yeah, unfortunately this thing is a bit of a fingerprint magnet. So next, we're going to take a look at the menu buttons here on the bottom. The two buttons on the far edges are going to be your select and start buttons, and then the inner buttons are going to control a screenshot mechanism as well as the BackBone app itself. Each of these buttons have a micro switch connection, which means they're going to be a little bit clicky and have very shallow travel as well. So next, let's take a look at the analog stick. These sticks are about the same as on a Nintendo Switch, and as you can see here, they do have some nice rotation to them, but they are a little bit limited in their amount of range. And these sticks also click down for L3 and R3 buttons as well. Overall, I would say these sticks are not bad, but they do feel quite small compared to something like a PlayStation or Xbox controller. Like I mentioned, they're going to be a lot like the Joy-Cons on the Nintendo Switch. Next, we're going to take a look at the four face buttons here on the right. Like with the menu buttons, these use a micro switch connection, so they are very clicky and have a shallow travel to them as well. And as far as dome switch buttons, I would say these are not terrible. They are pretty clicky and quite loud as well. But thankfully, they don't require a ton of force to press down on, so I don't think they're going to fatigue your hand over time. And so again, I think like with the analog stick, these are very reminiscent of the Nintendo Switch, but a little bit stiffer than those. And finally, let's take a look at the shoulder and trigger buttons right here. Now, the shoulder buttons also have a micro switch connection, but are much softer than the others. And they have a shallow travel to them, and they're actually very nice to press down on. Now, the triggers here are also easy to press down on, and they have an analog input. So if you press them halfway, it's going to register halfway in the game if it does support it. And so that's going to come in handy when you're playing something like a driving game that requires that analog input. Now, in terms of ergonomics, I've always been a fan of the BackBone controllers. Part of that is because they are slightly flared at the bottoms here, which means they are going to cup really easily into your hands. In fact, of all the telescopic controllers I've tested over the years, this one still remains my favorite in terms of ergonomics. In fact, here is my iPhone BackBone, and as you can see here, this thing has gone through a lot of wear and tear. And so with the exception of this printed adapter here that allows it to work on more modern iPhones, this one looks exactly the same as the one for the Android. And I've owned this controller for about 1.5 years now, and I don't play it every single day, but I would say I put in about 4 hours a month. And as I've mentioned before, this thing is quite a fingerprint magnet. I have actually cleaned this thing thoroughly several times in the past, but as you can see over time it just becomes smudge city. And so in a nutshell, as far as the hardware goes, I really don't have any complaints other than the smudginess of the plastic, which I really think is a minor gripe if anything. Overall, I think the BackBone is a winning formula and they've continued it here with the Android version. Now we're going to test this controller on two different Android phones. On the left here we have a Red Magic 7, which I reviewed on this channel about a year ago. And then on the right we have my LG V60. This is one of my favorite Android phones to convert into a dedicated gaming handheld. And they do fit pretty snugly into the BackBone 1. I should also mention this controller is not designed to be used with any sort of case. And so for most phones you will have to remove the case before adding it to the controller. Okay, now let's talk about the BackBone app, which is available on this controller. To start, I should mention this app is completely optional. You can use this controller without having to install anything else. Now, another thing that BackBone offers that is kind of confusing is their BackBone Plus paid membership. Like I mentioned, just using the controller or updating the firmware, things like that, none of those things cost any sort of money. But they do have a higher tier of membership, which they call BackBone Plus. And right now in the United States, this costs $40 a year. And here's a list of all the features and perks that come with that BackBone membership. You're going to have things like the Unified Game Hub, which I'll show here in a moment. And you'll also have the ability to use your BackBone as an independent controller hooked up to your Mac or your PC if you'd like. Additionally, they have a couple other features that are locked behind the paywall, like 1080p video capture, and the ability to use their in-app voice and text chat with friends or to live stream directly onto Twitch. Now, it's totally going to be up to you, but I've personally found that any of these perks here do not warrant that $40 annual price. For me personally, I've found that I just tend to use this controller for what it actually is, which is a controller for my phone. I appreciate that BackBone offers these additional features, but I've never been compelled to actually use them, let alone pay to unlock them. Either way, when I first opened up the app, it actually showed me this little announcement. It says that the app is going to be available completely for free, but the BackBone Plus subscription will be available at a later time. And so with that all out of the way, this is what the BackBone app looks like. It's going to have a list of some of the BackBone compatible apps that you have installed on your phone, and then it's going to have these other segments which will have recommended games that you can download and things like that. And to bring up this app, all you have to do is just press that little orange button on the bottom right and it'll pop right up. And so I would say that the interface here is pretty clean and easy to use. But like I mentioned, it just isn't a really good fit for the way I like to play my games. For me personally, I prefer to use the Daijisho front end as you see here, and this will allow me to navigate through all my emulated systems and open up whatever app I'd like as well. Now theoretically, you could press the BackBone button here and jump into the app if you want to use that, and then you can also just press the BackBone button again to exit out of it. And so I guess if you were interested in it, you could do some sort of hybrid like this, where you could navigate through your retro games, and then you could tap on the BackBone button to bring up some of the more modern options that you have available as well. Either way, that's how the BackBone app works. Now, when it comes to playing Android games, this is a very seamless experience. As long as the game itself has controller support, it should work just fine right out of the box. And thankfully, a lot of these Android games have aspect ratios that'll stretch to the entirety of the screen. And so if you do have this wide 20:9 aspect ratio on most modern phones, you should be able to play a lot of Android games this way. And personally, I think these games look really good on this big screen like this. Now, if you try to emulate something that's not at a 20:9 aspect ratio, for example the PSP, which is at 16:9, you are going to get some black bars here on the left and right. But I would say playing 16:9 content here on a bigger phone like this still looks pretty good. Moving to something a little bit less wide, here is the 3:2 aspect ratio on the Game Boy Advance, and as you can see, yes, the black bars are getting a little bit bigger on each side. And if you want to move over to 4:3 content like Super Nintendo, yeah, you're going to have a lot of black bars on each side. Of course, this is not specific to the BackBone controller, this is going to happen anytime you try to play a 4:3 system on some of these wider phones. Either way, when it comes to playing Android games or emulating your favorite systems, this controller is going to work out really well. And to top it off, I think the D-pad is very good. It has a precise input, which is going to work really well for platforming games like this. So now let's talk a little bit about game streaming. We'll start with Xbox Cloud Gaming using their official app. And I'm happy to report that this one works just fine out of the box. And so if you want to do remote play with Xbox or you want to do some cloud gaming, this should work out really well. In particular, I found that I really enjoy playing first-person shooters using this controller. Part of that has to do with the flared grips on the bottoms here because they make everything nice and ergonomic, but also I like the shallow travel on the analog triggers. They are very easy to press down on, which gives you almost a hairpin kind of feel. Either way, yes, first-person shooter games on this controller are great. Now on the BackBone controller for iPhone, you can use the official PlayStation Remote Play app and it'll work just fine. But unfortunately on Android, much like with any other third-party controller, you cannot use the official PlayStation Remote with anything but an official PlayStation controller. And so if you want to do any sort of remote play with your PlayStation 4 or 5, you're going to have to use a third-party app like Chiaki or PS Play. And so here I'm using PS Play, which is a paid app. It costs $5, but I think it's well worth it. And much like with the Xbox app, out of the box this one works perfectly. Not only do each of the buttons work properly, but the analog triggers are also analog too. And so for Ratchet & Clank, we can hold onto the trigger halfway and it'll shoot one bullet at a time. Or if I hold the trigger down all the way, it's going to respond like it does on the original PlayStation controller. And so long story short, remote play for Xbox and PlayStation work really well. And this controller works well with Web Arcade, which is a cloud-based gaming platform that I've showed a couple times here on this channel. And if you want to learn more about this, I'll leave a link to my latest video in the video description below. Now, the BackBone 1 isn't the only game in town. There are a couple other telescopic controllers that I think are worth mentioning. The first one I want to show here is the version 2 of the Razer Kishi, which came out a couple months ago. And I suspect that this one is heavily inspired by the original BackBone 1 controller. This one also costs $100 and has a very similar setup to the BackBone controller. There are some key differences, like the D-pad has a dome switch connection, and this one also has two multifunction buttons here on the top next to the triggers. Additionally, while this one does have pass-through charging, it does not have a headphone jack. Now when it comes to hooking up the phone, I would say it's a little bit less snug and easier to connect altogether. And yeah, it feels a lot like the BackBone, but does not have those flared grips, which I like so much. And so I would say just on first impressions here, it's a little bit less comfortable than the BackBone. In addition, when hooked up to the phone here, I feel like it's a little bit less sturdy than the BackBone as well. I feel like this one has a little bit more wiggle to it than I would like. Now another controller that's similar is this one here. This is the GameSir X2 Pro. Now this one also came out a couple months ago and is an improvement over their original X2. The X2 Pro now features analog triggers and also has two multifunction buttons here on the back. And like with the Razer, I would say this one's a little bit easier to hook up than the BackBone as well. And I would say between the three, this one feels a lot sturdier than the other two. And so if you're looking for something that's a little bit more durable and rugged, I would say this one's a better choice. But that being said, I would say it is the least ergonomic among the three too. It kind of feels like you're just hooking up a big brick to your device. A couple other things to note here, the face buttons are dome-style switches and a little bit larger than the other two. And the D-pad also has very clicky dome-style switches and is the smallest among the three as well. And so I would say I like the face buttons on this one the best, but the D-pad the worst. And like with the Razer controller, this one lacks a headphone jack as well. But overall, I would say it's not a bad experience, and it comes in at $20 cheaper than the other two, so this one is $80. However, at the end of the day, I would say I do prefer the BackBone controller altogether. Most of that has to do with the ergonomics of those flared grips, which are really nice to hold. Of course, the controller is not perfect. It does have some wiggle, but at the very least, it is less than what it is on the Razer Kishi version 2. Anyway, that's just a quick comparison here between these three controllers, and if you are interested in me doing a more in-depth review of the other two, let me know in the comments below. I've had these controllers for months at this point, but I've never actually opened them up until this review right here. But now that I have them open, I am thinking about doing a review sometime this month, so let me know in the comments below if you are interested in seeing that video. Either way, let's start wrapping up our review of the BackBone 1. To start, I would say I'm in a little bit of a strange predicament when it comes to reviewing this controller. After all, I've been using an identical controller for the past year and a half, so I knew exactly what to expect when I opened the box. And there are a lot of things about the BackBone 1 that I like. For example, I like the somewhat shallow travel and the analog triggers. It makes them very easy to use. Additionally, I'm a fan of the precise D-pad. I think it works really well with platform games in particular. But I would say my number one favorite trait about this controller is the flared grips, which give it a very ergonomic feel. Now that being said, it cost $99 and that is pretty steep. And really the only thing this one has over the competitors at a similar price range is the headphone jack. And so unless you're a big stickler for having a headphone jack with your controller, or you just want the best ergonomics possible, it is kind of hard to justify the $99 price point when there are cheaper options out there right now. Now personally, I've been very happy with my iPhone model, and I plan on doing the same with my Android phone as well. And so in the end, if you are willing to pay this price, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the BackBone 1. But if this controller is a little bit out of your price range, there are plenty of other options for cheaper. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Have you been waiting for the BackBone 1 for the Android, and are you going to pick it up? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.